Hey, this is John with FixYourDirtBike.com, and this is how to service the Shock Link on your 1997 through 2001 Honda CR250. Start with your bike on a stand with the subframe and shock absorber removed. I took off the rear wheel for video purposes, but you do not need to. Remove the lower chain roller to make room for the frame side connecting bolt. Remove the bolts and washers from the frame and swing arm. Reassemble your linkage and check that all bolts, washers, and pivot collars are accounted for. Remove the side collars and seals. Remove the inner bearing races. They should slide out, but they won't, so find a socket that fits over the inner race only and drive it out. Remove the old bearings. Removing the bearings requires a blind bearing puller. If you don't have one, don't bother buying one because they won't budge anyway if they're contaminated. That's why I went straight to the heat and beat method to remove them. The outer bearing race consists of two separate races mounted on each side of the bore with a gap in the middle. This means you need to heat and drive one side in slightly to break it free, then drive the other side into the bore to drive both bearings out the same direction. You may have to get creative with your sockets and clamps. On the 1997 model year, the link bearings are mounted in the frame, and in the 1998 through 2001 models, the bearings are mounted in the link. If you have a 97 model, you will need to take extra care when you heat and beat the frame bearings because the angle of attack is not square. Clean your linkage parts as thoroughly as you can and inspect for damage. If the link is damaged, it will need to be replaced. If the bearing bores are damaged, do what you can to smooth them out. Due to the bearings used in the linkage, you should be fine unless the bores are cracked or broken. For this service, I am using an all balls complete bearing kit. This kit includes all bearings, pivot collars, seals, and washers you need for a full service. However, when installing the swing arm end of this linkage, I ran into a fitment problem. The new pivot and slide collars were just a little too long to fit between the mounts on the swing arm, so I ended up cleaning and reusing the old side collars. These bearings are designed with a very thin outer race, so if you try to drive them in with a hammer and socket, the chance of damage is very high. These bearings need to be pressed in using a hydraulic press or a bolt and nut press. You can buy a proper bearing press kit for $150, or you can make one for $20 out of grade 8 bolt-in washers. Again, you will need to get creative with your sockets and washers. Before you install the outer bearing race, remove the bearing needles and set them aside. I like to insert a small socket inside the bearing race to help with alignment, but some aggressive adjustment is usually necessary. The thin outer race is very forgiving, so hammer adjustments won't hurt it, just don't go crazy. The bearings of the swing arm bore, frame on 97s, and shock link on 98-02s need to be driven into the bore 4 to 7 millimeters. Press the shock link bearing into the bore 6 to 7 millimeters. The shock absorber mount is the one small bearing and needs to be centered in the bore. Press the outer race in like the others, then carefully press or drive the race into the center, measuring as you go. Carefully install the needles in the bearing race. They should be coated in a light layer of grease from the factory so they stick together in the bore. If your needles aren't sticky enough, some white lithium grease will do the trick. Your needles should sit evenly with no gaps. With one side done, install the pivot collar to keep the needles in place as you install the opposite side. With both sides assembled and the pivot collar in place, secure the assembly with the zip tie. Add a thick layer of moly-based grease to the bearings. Remember, there is a gap between the bearings, so get as much grease as you can between them. Work the grease around the bearings into the needles, but be very careful. If you pull away from the bearing, like this, the needles will stick to the grease and come out. Work your finger around the needles, then slowly slide your finger out of the bore while keeping pressure on the needles. Grease each side, then install the seals with another coating of grease, followed by the pivot collar. On the widest bore, install the two large washers, followed by the seal and pivot collar. Secure the bearings with a zip tie again when you are done with each set. When installing the linkage assembly, make sure the shock arm is oriented correctly with the small end facing forward. With the link attached to the frame and the arm attached to the link, swing them around to make sure everything is rotating smoothly. If everything feels smooth, attach the shock arm to the swing arm. Torque all 3 bolts to 59 foot-pounds. Install the lower chain roller and torque to 106 inch-pounds. If you have any questions about the Shock Link service, please let me know in the comments or on social. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.